Colbert opened with his trademark grin, but those familiar with his recent interviews could detect something sharper beneath the surface. "Harrison Ford, everyone! The man who gave us Han Solo and Indiana Jones," he announced to enthusiastic applause. Ford acknowledged the crowd with a brief wave, his expression remaining guarded. "So, Harrison, you've been in this business for what, 50 years now?" Colbert began, leaning forward with apparent interest. "You've seen a lot of changes in Hollywood. What do you think about actors today getting involved in politics?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Ford's jaw tightened slightly. He'd been down this road before with other hosts, and he sensed where this was heading. "Well, Stephen, I think actors have always had opinions. We're citizens like everyone else." "Right. But don't you think there's a responsibility that comes with having a platform?" Colbert pressed, his tone becoming more pointed. "I mean, when someone like you speaks out, millions of people listen. Shouldn't there be some accountability?" Ford shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, Stephen. Are you suggesting actors shouldn't express their views?" The studio audience sensed the growing tension, their earlier enthusiasm dampening into an uneasy quiet. Colbert's smile never wavered, but his eyes had taken on a predatory gleam that regular viewers had come to recognize during his more confrontational interviews. "Not at all," Colbert replied smoothly. "I'm just wondering about the hypocrisy of it all. You've been very vocal about environmental issues, flying around in private jets to climate summits. Don't you see the contradiction there?" Ford's famous composure began to crack. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair as he leaned forward. "Now wait just a minute. And then there's your support for certain political candidates," Colbert continued, cutting him off. "You've endorsed politicians who've made some pretty controversial statements about working-class Americans. How do you reconcile that with playing these everyman heroes on screen?" The attack was swift and calculated, designed to put Ford on the defensive. The veteran actor's face flushed with anger, but he fought to maintain his dignity. "Stephen, I came here to talk about my work, not to be ambushed with—" "Ambushed?" Colbert laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm just asking questions that I think the American people deserve answers to. You put yourself out there politically, Harrison. You can't expect to hide behind your movie star status when someone calls you on it." The studio had gone dead silent. Even the production crew seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let the train wreck continue. Ford's publicist, watching from the wings, looked horrified as her client's carefully managed image began to crumble under Colbert's relentless assault. "I'm not hiding behind anything," Ford said through gritted teeth. "But I didn't come here to be lectured by someone who's made a career out of cheap shots and gotcha journalism." Colbert's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine anger underneath his television persona. "Cheap shots? That's rich coming from someone who's spent decades playing characters more interesting than he actually is." The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Ford's eyes narrowed dangerously, and for a moment it seemed like he might lunge across the desk. Instead, he slowly stood up, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the smaller host. "You know what, Stephen?" Ford said, his voice low and controlled. "I've dealt with a lot of difficult people in this business, but you might just be the most pathetic excuse for a journalist I've ever encountered." The words hit Colbert like a physical blow, and his carefully constructed television persona finally shattered completely. His face contorted with rage as he shot up from behind his desk, pointing an accusatory finger at the legendary actor. "Pathetic? You want to talk about pathetic? Let's talk about a 70-year-old man who still thinks he's Indiana Jones." The studio audience gasped audibly, some covering their mouths in shock. This had crossed every line of professional decorum, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would dominate headlines for weeks. Ford's publicist frantically gestured to the production team, but the cameras kept rolling, capturing every ugly moment of the meltdown. "At least I earned my reputation through talent, not by kissing up to network executives and pandering to the lowest common denominator, Ford shot back, his voice rising for the first time since the interview began. You're nothing but a carnival barker in an expensive suit, Stephen. A dancing monkey who thinks he's a journalist. Colbert's face had gone beet red, veins visibly pulsing in his temples. How dare you? I've built this show from the ground up. I've interviewed presidents, world leaders. And apparently it's gone to your head, Ford interrupted, stepping closer to the desk. You think that gives you the right to ambush guests and tear them down for your own entertainment? You're a bully, Stephen, and everyone in this room knows it. The accusation seemed to strike a nerve. Colbert slammed his hand down on his desk, sending his coffee mug clattering to the floor where it shattered, the brown liquid spreading across the polished surface. I'm a bully? You're the one standing there trying to intimidate me with your movie star presence. Well, guess what, Harrison? This isn't one of your movies, and I'm not some terrified extra. No, Ford replied coldly. You're just a coward who hides behind writers and producers. Tell me, Stephen, when's the last time you had an original thought that wasn't handed to you on a teleprompter? The insult was devastating in its simplicity, and Colbert visibly recoiled as if he'd been slapped. The studio audience had gone from shocked silence to uncomfortable murmuring, many beginning to film the confrontation on their phones despite security's attempts to stop them. The production crew stood frozen, caught between their professional obligations and their growing horror at what was unfolding. You sanctimonious piece of garbage, Colbert snarled, abandoning any pretense of civility. You think because you played some beloved characters that makes you untouchable? Well, let me tell you something about your precious legacy. Half your movies are unwatchable garbage, and the other half only worked because of better actors carrying your dead weight. Ford's composure finally snapped completely. His face turned crimson as decades of pent-up frustration with Hollywood politics and media manipulation boiled over. You want to go there, Stephen? Fine. Let's talk about your pathetic attempt at comedy. You're a cheap imitation of better hosts who came before you, riding on their coattails while contributing nothing original to the medium. At least I don't mumble my way through performances like I'm having a stroke, Colbert screamed back, his voice cracking with fury. You've been phoning it in for 20 years, and everyone knows it. The personal attacks had reached a fever pitch, with both men now standing face to face across the desk, their voices echoing through the stunned studio. Ford's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, while Colbert gripped the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles had gone white. You know what the real tragedy is, Stephen? Ford said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than all the shouting. You had a chance to be something special, to use this platform for good. Instead, you chose to become exactly what's wrong with media today. A bitter, cynical opportunist who tears people down to build himself up. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and for a moment, Colbert seemed genuinely stunned into silence. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, as if Ford's assessment had struck so close to home that it had temporarily robbed him of speech. But the vulnerability lasted only seconds before his rage returned with venomous intensity. Don't you dare lecture me about opportunity, Colbert exploded, his voice cracking with fury. You've had every advantage handed to you on a silver platter. You think your little speech makes you some kind of moral authority? You're nothing but a washed-up actor desperate to stay relevant. Ford shook his head slowly, a look of genuine disgust replacing his earlier anger. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't even hear criticism without lashing out like a child. No wonder your ratings are tanking. People are tired of this kind of toxic behavior masquerading as entertainment. The mention of ratings hit Colbert like a physical blow. His face went pale before flushing an even deeper shade of red. My ratings? My ratings? He screamed, spittle flying from his lips. I don't need career advice from someone whose last decent performance was in the Clinton administration. The studio audience had begun to shift uncomfortably in their seats. many looking toward the exits as the confrontation spiraled further out of control. Security personnel had moved closer to the stage, unsure whether to intervene or continue letting the cameras roll. The tension in the room was suffocating, like the moments before a violent storm breaks. "You want to know what's really pathetic, Stephen?" Ford continued, his voice maintaining that deadly calm that seemed to unnerve Colbert more than any shouting could. "You've become everything you used to mock. Remember when you had principles? When you stood for something other than cheap laughs and Twitter feuds?" Colbert's composure disintegrated completely. He swept his arm across his desk, sending papers, pens, and promotional materials crashing to the floor in a dramatic tantrum that would have been comical if not for its genuine viciousness. "Don't you dare talk to me about principles. You sold out to Disney faster than anyone in Hollywood history. At least I entertained people instead of poisoning them with this nightly dose of hatred and division," Ford shot back, gesturing around the studio with obvious contempt. "Look at what you've created here. An audience that cheers for conflict, staff members who are afraid to speak up, and a format that depends on humiliating guests for ratings. Is this really what you wanted to become?" The accusations seemed to hit every person in the room simultaneously. Several audience members looked down at their hands, suddenly ashamed of their earlier enthusiasm for the confrontation. Production assistants exchanged guilty glances, recognizing the truth in Ford's words about their workplace environment. Colbert noticed the shift in the room's energy and became even more desperate and aggressive. "You self-righteous hypocrite! You think you're better than everyone else because you fly around in your precious airplanes and lecture people about the environment? At least I'm honest about what I am." "Are you?" Ford asked quietly, the question carrying more weight than any insult. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like a man who's lost his way and is too proud to admit it. This isn't comedy, Stephen. This isn't journalism. This is just cruelty dressed up as entertainment." The simple observation seemed to cut deeper than any of the previous attacks. Colbert's face contorted with something beyond rage, a mixture of shame, fear, and desperate fury that made him look almost unhinged. "Get out," he whispered, his voice trembling with barely contained violence. "Get out of my studio right now." Ford straightened to his full height, his presence commanding even in the midst of chaos. "Gladly. But before I go, let me give you some free advice. Find yourself a mirror, Stephen, and take a long, hard look at what you've become. Because this isn't who you used to be, and it's certainly not who you should be." The actor turned toward the audience, many of whom were now visibly uncomfortable with the spectacle they had witnessed. "As for the rest of you," he said, his voice carrying easily through the studio, "maybe it's time to ask yourselves what kind of entertainment you're really supporting." The silence that followed was deafening. Ford's words seemed to pierce through the manufactured excitement that typically filled late-night television studios, replacing it with an uncomfortable self-awareness that left many audience members squirming in their seats. Some began to look around nervously, as if seeing their surroundings clearly for the first time. Colbert, meanwhile, had reached his breaking point. His face was a mask of pure hatred as he screamed across the studio, "Security! Get this has been out of here before I do something we'll all regret." His voice cracked on the last words, revealing the desperation beneath his fury. But Ford wasn't finished. He took a step closer to the audience, his commanding presence filling the space between the stage and the seats. "You deserve better than this," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You deserve hosts who respect their guests, entertainment that elevates rather than degrades, and media that brings people together instead of tearing them apart." Several audience members began to nod, and a few even started to applaud. Not the manufactured enthusiasm they'd been coached to display, but genuine appreciation for Ford's dignity in the face of Colbert's meltdown. The host noticed the shift immediately, and his rage reached new heights. "Don't you dare turn my audience against me!" Colbert shrieked, pointing wildly at Ford. "These people came here to see me, not listen to your sanctimonious garbage. You're nothing but a bitter old man who can't accept that his time is over. Ford turned back to face Colbert one final time, his expression a mixture of pity and disappointment. My time may be over, Stephen, but at least I'll be remembered for bringing joy to people, not for moments like this. He gestured around the chaotic studio, taking in the scattered papers, the broken coffee mug, and the host's disheveled appearance. This is your legacy now. This anger, this cruelty, this complete lack of professionalism. The observation hit Colbert like a physical blow. He seemed to deflate slightly, suddenly aware of how he must appear to the cameras that were still rolling, capturing every moment of his professional suicide. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his aggression. "Get out! Get out!" he screamed, his voice breaking completely. "I don't need lectures from someone who peaked 30 years ago. You're irrelevant, Harrison. Irrelevant." Ford shook his head sadly and began walking toward the stage exit. But as he reached the edge of the platform, he paused and turned back one last time. "You know what's truly sad, Stephen? I actually used to respect you. I thought you were one of the good ones. Someone who used humor to make important points, who brought intelligence to late-night television. But this version of you? This angry, bitter man who attacks guests for sport? This isn't comedy. It's just sad." With that devastating final assessment, Ford walked off the stage with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation. The studio fell into stunned silence as his footsteps echoed through the space, each step seeming to emphasize the magnitude of what had just occurred. Colbert stood behind his ruined desk, breathing heavily, his hair disheveled, and his shirt wrinkled from his tantrum. For a moment he seemed lost, unsure how to proceed. The cameras continued rolling, capturing his confusion and the aftermath of his complete professional breakdown. "Well," he said finally, his voice hoarse from screaming, "I guess that's our show for tonight." He attempted his trademark smile, but it came across as a grotesque parody of his usual charm. "We'll be right back after these messages." But as the show cut to commercial, everyone in the studio knew that nothing would ever be the same. Ford's principled stand had exposed something ugly at the heart of modern entertainment, and the footage of Colbert's meltdown was already being uploaded by audience members who had captured the confrontation on their phones. Within hours, the clips would go viral, sparking a nationwide conversation about civility in media and the responsibility of public figures to treat their guests with respect. Colbert's ratings would plummet as viewers abandoned his show in droves, disgusted by his behavior and inspired by Ford's dignity. The confrontation had ended with Ford walking away victorious, not through aggression or cruelty, but through the simple power of maintaining his principles in the face of unprecedented hostility. He had shown America what real strength looked like, and in doing so, had reminded everyone why true legends are remembered long after their critics are forgotten.